This is an interview at the Division of Military and Naval Affairs Headquarters, Latham, New York. It is the 3rd of September? October, God. Yeah. October 2003, 9 a.m. The interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
My name is Gerard Lehner. I was born in New York City. My date of birth is January 6th, 1924.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering service?
High school graduate.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I was in Washington, D.C. when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
Okay, well, that's my next question. Where were you and what do you remember? What was your reaction?
About that, I was still a senior in high school at that time. And my family went on a short vacation to Washington, sightseeing. And I can vividly remember MPs collecting all the military people, no matter where we were. They were collecting military people. Of course, we didn't know what had happened at that time. But I think it was that evening we were in Baltimore, and the report was all on the newscasts and everything else. It was quite an experience. Of course, even then, I don't think I knew where Pearl Harbor was at that time.
Most of the people we interviewed had no idea. Okay, did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted. I graduated from high school in February '42, and I got a job at the Western Electric Company, and I worked for them for 10 months, and then I enlisted in the Navy. I enlisted in November of '42.
Why did you select the Navy?
I didn't. I selected the Marine Corps originally, but I wanted to get into communications because that's what I was working for the Bell system. So I wanted communications, and the Marine Corps could not guarantee me that I would get communications. Was just as well, because I probably would not have come back from the service. So then I went to the Navy, and they didn't guarantee me much either, to tell you the truth, but they did say that I would get into at least electrical equipment. So
Where did you go for your?
satisfied me.
Okay. Where did you go for your basic training?
Great Lakes in January, February, and March. A real cold place, I'll tell you. Yeah, sure.
Okay, how long were you there?
In the lakes, I don't know, 12 weeks maybe, something like that. But still, of course, when I enlisted, they swore me in and they put me on inactive duty because they didn't have room in the boot camps. And then they called me up a couple of days after Christmas. I think the 29th of December, they called me up. And I went there, I took a train ride for hours to get to Great Lakes. God, I think we were up in Canada and back down. Trains were shuffled all over the place. You know?
Had you ever been away from your family before this?
Not really, just on vacations. So it was kind of traumatizing, I think, being within, well, among hundreds and hundreds of guys, but still, you felt alone. Absolutely, because you didn't know anybody at that time.
Where did you go after Great Lakes?
After Great Lakes, I went to Purdue University. They sent me to an electrical school, so they were keeping part of their bargain right there. So I went to Purdue University for electrical school. I spent, I don't know how many weeks, quite a long time. We went through the regular electrical engineering course, and I come out of there as a third-class electrician's mate. In fact, I was second out of 198 guys that graduated. It was a very good course. I enjoyed that. I really did. I left there, and I was sent to the Consolidated Edison Company in New York City, which was great because I lived in New York. And I was there couple of months. And all I did was go around with the operating engineers generating electricity. And I think that's why we were there, to get acclimated to generating, steam generating. And I enjoyed that, except that I was on Pier 92. I don't know if anybody ever told you about Pier 92.
No.
Was a receiving ship in the Navy. We all lived on a pier. And the old Seattle, the USS Seattle, but was probably part of the old Great White Fleet that Teddy Roosevelt had. That was berthed right there. Some people slept on that, the rest of us slept on the pier. We didn't do nothing but work details. That's all we had. They tried to keep us busy while we were there waiting for assignments.
Now, sleeping on the pier, were you in buildings or tents? Or?
We were, well, those piers in New York, the second floor was like a big, long warehouse.
Oh, yes. That's right.
And it was just full of bunks, that's all. I think they were triple bunks. We slept in that, mustered every morning, turned to for work details. That's the way that was. That didn't last too long, a couple of weeks, that's all that was. And then my name came up on the board with an assignment. I was assigned to USS Sullivans as part of the pre-commissioning crew, because the ship had been laid down as the Putnam originally. But when the 5 Sullivan boys were lost, Roosevelt decided to name a ship for the boys. And they selected the hull, whatever the hull number was at that time for the Putnam, as being the ship they were going to name the Sullivans. So I wound up in what we called Treasure Island. At that time was the island, Goat Island, it was off of San Francisco. And we gathered together as the crew. The crew guys kept coming in. And we did a lot of work on a loading machine, a 5-inch loading machine. And just more or less did things to try and get us guys that had never been on a ship before acquainted with ships and what it would be like, right? I met one fellow there from Beverly, Massachusetts. His name was Sullivan. In fact, we had 27 guys on the ship were named Sullivan. He used to call a roll by initials, HF, RP, BQ. We had so many Sullivans they couldn't just say Sullivan. So, but I think at one time they were going to try and man the whole ship with Sullivans.
Really?
And I recall old Pat Sullivan. He was an uncle for the 5 boys. And he was an old man to us. By that time I was probably 19. He must have been in his late 30s or 40s. He was an old man as far as we were concerned. But he was aboard for quite a few months with us, in fact, out to the Pacific. And they finally took him back with the family, because at that time, I think the daughter of the Sullivans, Genevieve, she enlisted in the Navy, and I think they wanted Pat out of the action. They didn't want him out there. There were too many in that family gone already. But one of the things we did was keep in contact with the Sullivan family. The officers, the men, we wrote to the family, Ma and Pa Sullivan. We were in contact with them, they were in contact with us. And I found out later on, when the ship was recommissioned in the Korean War, those people, the officers, the commanding officers, and all the officers and the men, they continued keeping in touch with the Sullivan family, which was something. And I think it made a lot of esprit de corps for the crew.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, we finally commissioned the Sullivans, went on shakedown. I think we went down to San Diego. First time I had ever been to sea. Was lucky though, I never got seasick. on the ship. I was probably one of the few that never did. Although one thing that always sticks with me is the only pokey bait is candy on the ship. The only candy that they had was dark chocolate candy. And to this day, if I have dark chocolate, I can still feel that ship rocking and rolling, right? That was really something. Huh?
Any serious problems with the ship on the shakedown?
No, on the shakedown, no. Minor stuff that the yard took care of or we took care of.
Mm-hmm.
And it was good. As I recall, there was nothing major with the ship at all.
Everything was brand new and nice on it?
Everything was brand new. We hadn't had to repaint anything yet. It was all new, yeah.
Now, what was your assignment as an electrician then?
Well, we had an electrical department. I'm trying to remember how many. I know we had one old-time chief, Carver, his name was. We had a couple of first class, a couple of second class. I was a third class. Come aboard ship for the first time here. I'm a petty officer already, you know. So, but we took care of all the electrical equipment. We mostly took turns on heavier work, if there were any motors or something to work on. We did that. My first battle station was on the searchlights, 36-inch lights, real big lights. They were carbon arc things, so they had to have somebody with them to strike the arcs that they needed them, right? I hope they never did. I was up there, because my station was right up with the this fellow Sullivans that I met. He and I were both on those things. And then after that, telephones, sound power telephones we took care of. Those were part of the interior communications. Engine order telegraphs, rotor angle indicators, all that kind of stuff we took care of. And then later on I was just interior communications later on. But we did everything. Then we stood watches on the generators. We mostly were 4-hour watches. 4 on, 4 off, 4 on, 4 off. And sometimes in the after engine space, sometimes in the forward engine space. It kept changing. They changed around.
Mm-hmm.
As people came on and off. We didn't have too many transfers. For all the time we were in the Pacific, it was almost 2.5 years, we had about the same crew. I would say maybe 10 or 15 guys in all departments were transferred on and off, so that time. So we got to know one another pretty well. So we left after shakedown. We left San Francisco, and of course by that time I had already been out under the Golden Gate Bridge and hit those swells out there. That was one thing about Frisco. The swells outside the harbor were terrible. The ship really moved around. Right? We went to Pearl Harbor. I think there were 2 other destroyers with us when we went out to Pearl Harbor. We were assigned to Desron 52, the Lucky 7, I remember that. And we were in that same squadron for the whole war. There were 9 of us altogether, 9 ships. 2 divisions, that's how they broke that up. One division had 5 destroyers, the second division had 4 destroyers. I can remember some of them. Miller, Stephen Potter, Tingy, Hancock. That's all I can remember. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them. And it's funny, I belong to the Desron 52 Association, which is a squadron association. And we have reunions that way too. But I haven't been to a reunion at that group for quite a while. But we got to Pearl. I remember that Pearl was still big mess. There still must have been 2 or 3 inches of oil on the harbor. It was terrible.
Now, when was this that you arrived?
Well, this had to be September, October maybe, 43.
And they still had oil slicks.
Oh, yeah, the oil was all over the place. Well, it was still coming up out of the ships.
yes,
that were
right.
down, you know, bubbling up out of them. It was terrible. Well, we operated out of Pearl for maybe 2 weeks with carrier groups. I guess to get our officers acquainted with how they were going to operate. We were assigned, our squadron was assigned to fast carriers. And almost the whole time I was out there, that's what we operated with, the fast carriers. And after a while, we had so many carriers out there, it was hard to believe the amount of ships that would gather together for different invasions and things like that. We were probably in on every landing operation from the Marshals. The Marshals were the first thing we took part in. We were in every one. The Marshals, the Marianas, Peleliu, Palau, Guam, Iwo, right up to Okinawa. And we were in them all. We saw a lot of action. But we were a lucky bunch, I'll tell you. We all thought that those 5 Sullivan brothers were looking down, taking care of us. We lost 1 man in the whole war. And he must have fell overboard because he had been in a whaleboat, trying to remember, it was in Majuro, I think, it had to be in the first operation we were in. After they took the Marshall Islands, we wound up in Majuro as a fleet anchor. It was a big enough atoll, they put the whole fleet in there. We wound up there, and the officers, I think, went ashore. All it was a sandy island. They went over there, though. And this young fellow, his name was Johnson. He was the bow hook, I think, in the whaleboat. And all the officers went ashore, and I think I had to swim in because there were no piers or anything like that. And they swam in, and as I understood it, he couldn't swim. So he stayed with the boat. They had to have somebody stay with the boat anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So he stayed with the boat. But then after a while, they found the boat drifting. And they never really knew what happened to him. The only thing we could surmise was that he maybe moved around in the whaleboat and fell overboard, and was drowned. It's the only man we lost. We had other guys wounded, but 2.5 years and all that action, and we only lost 1 man. Fantastic. When I remember what happened to other ships out there, and we saw, particularly toward the end of the war, when those kamikazes were gone, the destroyers were being lost. We were losing 4 or 5 destroyers a day to kamikazes. Not only destroyers, carriers, battleships, everything were being hit with those things.
Were you ever under direct attack by kamikazes?
Whole year, all the time we were out there.
Mm-hmm.
And the kamikazes, I think, were only about the last year we were out there. They didn't start that until afterward. But yeah, we were something that we used to ride picket duty. Well, maybe you don't know, but the task groups, a task force would be made up of 3 groups, and each task group had maybe 2 carriers, a battleship, a couple of cruisers, 15 cans, and they would steam just over the horizon from one another. It would be like 3 groups together, but we couldn't see one group or the other because we were just far enough away below the horizon. You couldn't. And we used to steam in a circle. The group was in a circle, destroyers outside, carriers and the capital ships in the center. And when we made turns, the whole circle just turned 90 degrees. You know, we didn't go around a ring, we just turned 90 degrees. And that's the way we operated. And after a while, because there was so many air attacks, the Japanese, because we were out in between all those islands, and the Japanese had airfields on all of them, and we were always under attack by land aircraft. And unless the fleet was around, the Jap fleet, and then we had naval aviators coming after us too. But we used to put a ship like at 4 points, one ahead, maybe 10, 12 miles ahead, 10 or 12 miles behind, and on each side, so that if there were airplanes coming in, the radar was good, but it wasn't that good. So we'd have a ship on picket at one of these spots, so if there were planes coming in, we'd spot them first with our radar, which would give the whole force a lot more time to respond. And I can remember being on picket, jet planes going over the top and with radio. And we also directed some of the fighter planes. We became fighter directors because when the planes come in, we directed 3 or 4 planes to go after the Japanese planes. The planes would go over us. Of course, they were all looking to hit the big ships, not the small boys. We used to call it destroyers. They'd go over us, and you know, we figured, hope they passed us. They'd come back for those guys, right? But then we'd maybe stay on picket for a couple of days or a week, and then we'd go back and we'd be relieved. There'd be another one come out. A ship would relieve us, a destroyer, and the Japanese would hit them right away. First time, boom. We'd go back out, take their place. Nothing happened to us. Next guy come out, he'd get clobbered too. That's why I say I think those boys are always looking over us. But those sometimes, well, I don't know, I was just thinking of something and I lost it all just now. But we were in a lot of the action out there. A lot of stuff I don't think you want to remember. You know, you remember the funny things, you remember the people you were with. We have reunions now. Every 2 years we meet. We've been meeting since 1959, the crew of the Sullivans. Well, we have a new Sullivan ship, a guided missile destroyer, and those people that have been serving on that since 1995, I think, some of them belong to our association, so they're meeting with us too. And even those people were all in touch with the Sullivans families.
How many members of the family are still living?
Well, Albert Sullivan was the only one who was married, and he had a son, Jimmy. And Jimmy's been to a lot of our reunions. Jimmy had 2 children, John and Kelly. And Kelly Sullivan christened the new Sullivans. So they've still been in touch. And Kelly Sullivan is very, very involved with the new ship. Every time the ship comes into port in the States, Kelly manages to get there. She's a school teacher. She has children of her own, too. But I don't think there's anybody else left. Genevieve is dead, Ma and Pa Sullivan gone. Of course, the boys all went together. That was a tough thing. I don't know how any family could put up with that. 5 gone at one time.
Now I'll change the topic a little bit. You mentioned in your form that you sent in that one of the highlights was the Shellback initiation. You want to tell us about that?
Well, first time we crossed the equator, of Of course, I was a polywog, and that's what they called you if you hadn't been across the equator before. So they put on a real show. The old timers got dressed up. I don't know where they got the stuff from, but the Neptune's queen, I think her hair was was a mop that they put on the guy's head. He was the queen. We had a King Neptune, of course. They piped him aboard. We crawled. We were in our skivvies. We crawled up the decks, and that was rough because they had that anti-slip stuff on the decks. It was like sandpaper. Crawled along that, and we crawled through canvas chutes that were full of garbage and salt water. Really something. They spread graphite grease on us. But you could wash the grease off, but the graphite, little pieces of graphite, you were picking off for weeks afterwards. Cut your hair off. It was, but it was something I think that took our mind off what was going on around us. And of course, the next time we crossed the equator, if we had any new people, and we always had a few that were new, we got to put on the show, you know. So it was pretty good. It was just a diversion, I think, mostly, right? They also had a golden dragon when you cross the international date line. Not as elaborate as Shellback, though. And I got after the war, I got a certificate that big saying that I was a Shellback, very elaborate. And that certificate is framed, and it's in the mess hall in the Sullivans in Buffalo. And I gave that to them, they put that there. I still have a Shellback card I carry. Don't mean anything to anybody but me, but I still got it. That's the way it goes.
Now, you also mentioned about what happens to a destroyer in heavy seas, and especially, were you off Okinawa for the big typhoon?
Yes, I was. I'll never forget that. Well, in the Pacific is a strange ocean. It's well named because most of the time it's like a sheet of glass. And the dawn and dusk is beautiful because on a ship, you know, you can see 360 degrees around 6 miles or more in any direction depending on how high you're on the ship. And it's just beautiful, right? But when it gets rough out there, it is what I would say rough. Now, in the Korean War, I was in the Atlantic Ocean, and I thought that ocean was rough all the time, right? And the guys in the Atlantic kept telling me, oh, no, it's not rough. Wait till we spend the winter out here in the Atlantic, you know. But the Pacific, that rough weather would come on all of a sudden. And I can remember a lot of rough weather was not typhoons. It never got to be that much, but it was rough. And one time we were in Ulithi, I think it was, and Ulithi was a fleet anchor again. As we moved up in the islands, the fleet moved up to different anchorages. And we were in Ulithi, and one thing I didn't like about the Navy was every time a storm came, they always thought you were better out in the storm than you were in a harbor. So we'd up anchor and out we'd go into the storms. One time there in Ulithi, we were tied up in a nest, a destroyer nest. Destroyers were small ships, and they used to berth together. They'd just tie up to one another. Maybe one would have an anchor down, and they'd be just tied up to one another, or you'd be tied up to a tender. You didn't get much time to do this, but for repairs, there was a tender that would take care of repairs. We got some heavy weather in Ulithi once, I remember. We had the anchor down. Oh, no, we didn't. We were tied up, somebody else did, But the weather was bad enough so that I think there were 4 destroyers together, were being blown by the wind. The anchors weren't holding, and the ships were dropping anchors one after the other, trying to keep us in one spot. No good. So they had I think we lost one anchor. We pulled up the other one and got underway. We picked up a whaleboat that had been blown around. There were a couple of guys in it. We picked that up. And a couple of ships got blown onto the sand in the atoll. We managed to get out of the opening, get out to sea. But they always thought, hey, we're better out here. I never thought that. I thought we'd be better someplace closer to land, right? We could do that. But that typhoon, that was in 44. I think it was December 44. That was unbelievable that we used to walk on the ship in that weather with 1 foot on the bulkhead and 1 foot on the deck. And when the ship rolled the other way, you had to get over on the other bulkhead because I don't know how many degrees they went over, 50, 60 degrees. You used to wait hoping that things come back up, you know? But it did, except for 3 of them, the Spence, the Hull, and the Monahan. I'll never forget their names. 3 destroyers rolled over and sank in that storm. Must have been 700 men gone, just like that. The next day, when it calmed down a little, we were all looking, trying to pick up survivors. I don't think we got more than 30, 35 guys of all 3 ships. From then on, I worried when it rolled. I had figured, the engineers figured this all out. That ship's not going to roll over, you know. But there was reasons for it. I think we had been fueling or refueling, and we used to fuel from tankers that came out, and we'd ride alongside them, 1 ship on each side of the tanker with the hoses across. We'd take fuel that way, doing 10, 15 knots, you know, and when you got a big tanker and a destroyer on each side, or a battleship on one side, destroyer on the other side, trying to keep the ships even and spaced the way they should be. God, that was a worry. That was more of a worry than anything else, that we wouldn't collide with one another, you know. At one time, remember, our ship veered away from the tanker. The hoses pulled out of the fuel trunks. The whole ship got covered with that bunker oil. Yeah. Boy, we were scrubbing that off for a long time, right? And I remember that we were fueling, and it got so rough that we were going to break away, I think, and they decided to drop the hoses. And we had taken about 75% of fuel, and that must have been enough to keep us balanced pretty good. The other ships didn't get the fuel, so they were light, and that may have been why I think they went over, they made a 90-degree turn, the whole force did, and I think that's when they rolled over. They must have went broaching the sea some way that kicked them over there. But we managed to get through that. But they're bad. Our typhoons are bad. And then you know that weather is coming, because they spread the word around. You know, we all knew that was coming. So you spend a lot of time tying everything down, making sure everything is tight, ship shape, we used to call it in the Navy. But you didn't realize the things you missed until you got into that rough weather. And then there was stuff flying all over the place. So a couple of times the depth charges broke loose on the ship. And there'd be a couple of guys from the gunnery department up there trying to corral the depth charges. And those, especially the 600-pounders that were rolling around, a couple of guys trying to stop them and lash them down. It was something else. Then, rough weather, there's always somebody goes overboard. Not from our ship, thank God, but We had one guy went off a carrier one time, but I don't think that was rough weather. I think he walked off the carrier, or was thinking about something else and went right off the flight deck, right? We picked him up, right? But there are other ships, you get in rough weather if you're on deck, on duty, or on watch, and those waves come over, boy, they wash you right off. Wash you right off. And some of the guys I admired most in the Navy were the swimmers. There were certain guys assigned as swimmers on the ship. And if there were a man overboard, anything, picking up survivors, they would pass the word away swimmers. And these guys, regardless of what the weather was, time of the day or night, these guys would go over the side, go swimming out to rescue someone. If they had enough time, maybe they'd be in their swimming trunks. If not, they'd just kick off their shoes and out they'd go. Sometimes they had safety lines, sometimes they didn't. But those guys, when they called away swimmers, they went out. We picked up from the Bunker Hill, we picked up 166 men. And our swimmers were in the water a couple of hours, getting survivors, helping them up. We'd throw cargo nets over the side. And most of the guys that were in the water for any length of time, survivors, they had trouble trying to get up those cargo nets. And these swimmers would be out there pulling them in, helping them up the cargo nets until we could get a hold of them on the deck and pull them up. The Houston and Canberra, when they got hit, we picked up 118 men from the Houston. Getting the swimmers are out there. We one time lost 3 guys off the fantail. They got washed. We made a quick turn, high-speed turn. Whole fantail went underwater when we turned around. And these guys were on watch in the after 20-millimeter guns and washed them, 3 of them, washed them right off the fantail. One guy got tangled up in a lifeline, broke his legs. The other 2 guys went down. We thought sure as hell they went into propellers, right? But again, over the swimmers go. They got them back. They got the 3 guys back. I always remember Dutch Perma was one of those swimmers. And I can remember at the reunions, Kirkpatrick was one of the guys they pulled out of the water. And every time he saw Dutch Parma, he put his arms around him and said thanks, because he was one of the guys who were right next to the propeller when he went in. Jeez. But those guys were great. And we knew they were there. We knew if we went over, they'd be out for us. They'd come get us. Yeah. It was good. I mentioned the Houston and Canberra. When they got hit, the Canberra got hit by a torpedo first, aerial torpedoes, I think they were. And we escorted the Houston to the group the Canberra had been in to take the Canberra's place. And the Houston was there, I think, for 3 hours, 4 hours, something like that. And the Houston got hit by a fish, another aerial torpedo. And they took the 2 crippled cruisers and made up a force of the crippled cruisers, 1 carrier, a light carrier, the Cowpens, I think it was, and 2 other cruisers and 9 destroyers. And we were going to take them back, get them out of away from the Jap planes. The beginning of the war, if they got a ship hit real bad, they used to torpedo it themselves and sink it. They couldn't be bothered doing anything. Later on, though, when I got out there, they weren't doing that anymore. They were going to save every ship they could, especially the bigger ships, the capital ships. And at this time, they were going to save those 2 cruisers. So I remember the Boston, which another cruiser, took the Houston in tow. Port of Canberra, one of them. The cruisers were towing cruisers to get them away from the Jap planes. And Houston was hit again by torpedoes. And we picked up 118 men, I think, from Houston. Quite a few bodies. Of course, we buried those guys right from the ship. Was hard picking them up. But we got those cruisers back. We got them back to Ulithi, and then they took them to the States, fixed them up. Before the war was over, they were back out there again. They were back out. Same with the Bunker Hill. When she got hit, she was hit by kamikazes. That whole ship went on fire. Ammunition going off all over the place. We got as close as we could to try and help with hoses. A lot of the men, of course, the carrier turned into the wind, and all the flames and everything went to the back of the carrier, and the guys in the back, they just had to get off. They jumped off the flight deck, they jumped out of the ventilation ducts, everything, right? We were picking guys up there too. Long time. We buried guys then too. That was tough. Of course, you always thought it could be you, you know, but it wasn't. I survived. Yeah, those are some of the things that you kind of put out of your mind, I think. And you just remember the laughter and the good friends. That's what you do.
Do you remember where you were and your reaction when you heard about the death of President Roosevelt?
No, we were someplace in the Pacific. That's all I know. I don't remember where we were when that happened. I always thank Harry Truman for dropping those bombs.
That was my next question. What was your reaction? And what was
Yeah.
the ship's reaction?
Well, when he dropped the bombs, we were back in the States. We had been involved in Okinawa, and we had already been out there for 2.5 years, and they decided that before we invaded Japan, that a lot of the ships had to be refit and updated. We had to have more anti-aircraft guns and things like that. So on the 6th of June, I think, or no, sometime in June, we were sent back to the States for refit. So we got back in the States, and we got they gave us leave, I think 30 days leave. We got in 2 parties. I was in the first party, I remember that. And the other thing I remember vividly was that when we got to Pearl Harbor on the way back, the executive officer flew back to the States from Pearl Harbor. And he had information on everybody in the first leave party and how we wanted to go home and where we were going. He made all the flight arrangements, train arrangements, bus arrangements. When we got into Frisco, all we had to do was get all the ammunition off the ship, and then we were gone. We had bus ticket, everything. We went right home. And I remember I was in Grand Central Station on my way back to the West Coast when they dropped the first atom bomb. And I was in North Platte, Nebraska on the train when the war ended. And in North Platte, there was like a USO club in North Platte. The whole town met every train that came through North Platte, Nebraska. And they had coffee and soda and donuts and sandwiches for all the service people. And we were in North Platte when the war ended. And I can remember the bells started ringing in the town. We could hear them. We were on a train, you know. And all the townspeople are running down to the railroad station, and the train takes off. We go out. And the war was over. And that, I remember, I got to San Francisco and I was a day early. And I can remember the Marine on the gate telling me, "You got a day to go. Don't come in here. You come in here, you're not going to get out." Because they tore up San Francisco, I guess, when the war ended. You know, everybody was so happy. Right? So he said to me, "Don't come in here. You're not going to get out." But I said, "Hey, I've been on a train for 3 days. I think, you know, I got to get in there. Or I got a bed. I can sleep." Yeah. That was, and like I say, I forever think Harry Truman is my hero. Because if we had to invade Japan, we would have had, the casualties would have been horrendous. Because kamikazes, and there was no way to stop those guys. Unless you could hit them directly with a shell, blow the plane apart. Even then, sometimes you hit them, and they still manage to hit the ship. Right? We stayed with the Halsey Powell, another destroyer. We had been refueling from carrier, and the Halsey Powell took a kamikaze. Now these planes came in suddenly. Now I don't know what happened to our radar, but these things come in almost before we knew it. And we had finished fueling. Halsey Powell was alongside the carrier, taking fuel, and they broke away, but they didn't get far enough away from the carrier. Kamikaze was after the carrier, I guess, but missed the carrier, hit the Halsey Powell. Hit him on the fantail, killed everybody in the after steering. Fact is that a little big hole right through the back of the ship. The after 5-inch mount was almost underwater, and we sent our doctor, Dr. Basson, and Bill McCrae, who was a hospital corpsman, over to help with the wounded. And we stayed with the Halsey Powell to get her back to Ulithi, I think. But there were so many ships hit with those kamikazes that it was impossible. I still wonder the fact that we never got hit. Luck of the Irish. That's had to be what it was. We came through that whole thing. Then I got discharged. And at that time, everybody thought we were going to be fighting the Russians right after the war. Mm-hmm. So I enlisted in the Naval Reserve. And then I never got mad at Harry Truman, even when he called me up to go in the Korean War. But I got called back. I was married and had 2 kids, and got called back in the service. But that time I spent in the Atlantic on a destroyer escort.
How'd you compare a destroyer escort to a destroyer?
Well, there were 2 things bad about a destroyer escort, the one I was on. It was a class that was a straight diesel ship. We had Fairbanks Morse engines. And that whole ship and all my clothes and everything stunk of diesel fuel. It was terrible, right? And the DE had no speed. Flank speed, I think, was 20 knots. And coming off a destroyer, where we could hit 35, 37 knots sometimes, you know. It was a slow ship, I gotta say that. Plus the fact that I think the captain of that ship, 2 motor machinist mates, were regulars. Everybody else was recalled reserves, and it was not a happy ship, I'll tell you. Now, but we stayed in the Atlantic. I never did get over in the Pacific again. Stayed in the Atlantic. And it was funny, when he called me up, I had 30 days to go on my enlistment, my reserve enlistment. And Harry was nice enough to give me another year. So I put in 13 months in the Korean War. And, but, like I say, I remember good things about the Navy. My naval service was, of course I was a kid when I went in the war, you know. The war was exciting, but my naval service I thought was good for me. And I've been involved with Navy things ever since. I belonged to the Navy League, Naval Institute, belonged to all kinds of associations with the Navy. And that association is good. The friends I made in the service, marvelous.
Did you ever make use of the GI Bill?
No, because I had a job.
Mhm.
When I had been with the Western Electric Company for 10 months before I enlisted.
Mhm.
And when I came out, I went right back to work.
So you didn't use the,
I
didn't use the 52?
52, 20, no.
Okay.
And I didn't use it after the Korean War either. We had something like that, I think. But again, I left the Western Electric Company. They paid the difference in my salary the first time for 3 months, I think. They made up the difference in my salary for 3 months, the difference between my Navy salary and that. Then when I came back, all my time was bridged. In the Korean War, I was married then, so they paid the difference in my pay for 6 months. And again, when I came back, all my service was bridged with the company. So that way I made out pretty good. I never did take advantage of 5220, was it?
Yes.
5220, yeah.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for your interview.
You're quite welcome.